You probably have a fairly specific routine around using the bathroom: a door that closes, a seat, plumbing that removes the consequences of the whole business before you've finished washing your hands. The modern toilet is so normalized that it barely registers as technology. It just is. It has always been, except that it hasn't, and for the majority of human history, and specifically for the people who spent months at sea on wooden ships with no plumbing, the entire arrangement was radically different in ways that tell you something surprisingly interesting about life, hierarchy, disease, and the social organization of floating wooden communities. Let's start with the basic mechanics, because the answer to where pirates went to the bathroom is actually more specific than you might expect. The front of the ship, the bow, had a structure called the beakhead. This was a platform that extended out in front of the hull, used partly for handling the bowsprit and the rigging attached to it, and partly as the designated toilet area for the crew. The name toilet, or more precisely the name head, which is still used as a nautical term for bathroom today, comes directly from this arrangement. The head of the ship, the front, the platform over the water at the bow where the crew would squat, do what needed doing, and let gravity and the ocean handle the rest. A few wooden planks, a hole or several, the open sea below, and the constant movement of the ship providing natural ventilation of a very immediate kind. This was not comfortable. This was not private. The beakhead was exposed to the elements, to the spray of the bow wave, to wind and rain, and whatever weather the Atlantic or the Caribbean happened to be offering that day. In any kind of rough sea, using the head required genuine physical effort and some risk. You were holding yourself over a platform that was pitching and rolling with the ship, with open water underneath, while managing your clothing and your balance simultaneously. Falls happened. Men went overboard from the head. It was one of the documented ways sailors died at sea. Not commonly, but often enough to be a known hazard. There was also a rope. Hanging from the beakhead, trailing in the water as the ship moved, was a length of rope that served as the universal cleaning mechanism. You used the rope, you dropped it back in the water, the motion of the ship rinsed it, and the next man used the rope. This was the technology. This was the system. Not because sailors were cavalier about hygiene, but because options were limited in ways that are genuinely difficult to imagine from within the comfort of modern plumbing. The hierarchy mattered here in ways that are telling. Common crew used the head at the bow. The captain and the ship's officers had different arrangements. The captain's cabin was at the stern, the rear of the ship, and captains typically had a chamber pot or a close stool, which was essentially a wooden box with a seat and a removable container inside. Officers at various ranks had varying degrees of privacy and comfort depending on their station. The further up the hierarchy you were, the further you were from the bow, literally and figuratively. Power and comfort have always tracked each other, and on a wooden ship at sea, the tracking was unusually direct. The captain didn't stand in the spray at the front of the ship. The captain had furniture. For the common pirate or sailor who could not be choosy and who spent most of their time at sea as part of a crew of anywhere from 50 to several hundred people on a vessel that had no way of generating privacy, the arrangements were what they were. You used the head when you needed to, if the weather made the head unusable, if the ship was in battle, if you were sick and couldn't make the journey to the bow, you used whatever was available. Buckets existed on ships for exactly this reason. Bilge pumps were necessary not only because ships leaked, but because the bilge, the lowest interior space of the ship, accumulated everything that accumulated on a vessel, carrying large numbers of men for extended periods. The smell of a wooden sailing ship is something historical accounts describe with considerable feeling. The combination of unwashed bodies, rotting food stores, bilge water, livestock that were sometimes kept aboard for fresh food, and the basic biological realities of large numbers of people in a confined space produced an environment that visitors who boarded these ships from shore found immediately and powerfully unpleasant. Crew members adapted. The nose, given no choice, adjusts. But the adjustment period for newcomers was reportedly significant. Here is what is genuinely interesting about all of this, which is not the obvious point about discomfort. The interesting point is about disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and other gastrointestinal illnesses traveled through ships the way they traveled through any community without clean sanitation, which is efficiently and with devastating effect. The rope at the head was shared, the water was not clean, the food was stored in conditions that we would now recognize as perfect for bacterial growth. Scurvy gets most of the attention in discussions of sailor health because its cause and its solution make for a satisfying story. The absence of vitamin C, identified eventually, addressed by citrus fruit on naval vessels. Simple and dramatic in retrospect. But gastrointestinal disease killed more sailors than scurvy did. More sailors than enemy fire did. More sailors than storms did. The single greatest cause of death on extended voyages was not the enemy, not the weather, and not the sea. It was the biological consequences of putting large numbers of people in a confined space with inadequate sanitation for months at a time. The pirate ships of the Golden Age of Piracy, roughly 1680 to 1730, were not fundamentally different from naval or merchant vessels in terms of sanitation. The image of pirates as uniquely filthy or uniquely crude in their habits is not supported by the historical record. They used the same arrangements because those were the arrangements that existed. What differed was sometimes the organization of the ship, the governance structures that pirates developed, which were in certain respects more democratic and more attentive to crew welfare than the arrangements on naval vessels, where discipline was imposed from above with violence as the backstop. The articles, the written agreements that pirate crews operated under, often included specific provisions about the division of plunder, medical care for injured crew members, and compensation for disability. They were, in their own way, remarkably systematic documents for an enterprise that is usually characterized as pure chaos and violent improvisation. But they did not include provisions about sanitation, because sanitation on ships was simply the head and the rope, and everyone understanding the arrangement. There were innovations over time. Later in the 18th century, dedicated toilet seats of a sort began to appear on some ships, wooden structures that improved on simply squatting over a hole. Naval regulations began to address cleanliness more explicitly as the connection between filth and disease became harder to ignore, even before germ theory formally established the mechanism. Hammocks, which pirates and sailors used for sleeping, were actually a hygienic improvement over sleeping on the bare deck, which was the older practice. The hammock could be aired, it kept you off the bilge level. Small innovations accumulated, but the fundamental arrangement, the head at the bow, the rope, the shared reality of life at sea, persisted for as long as wooden sailing ships persisted. What this tells you, ultimately, is something about the relationship between technology and dignity. The things we now consider basic requirements, the things that feel so obvious they barely seem worth naming, were not obvious. They were invented. They were incrementally improved. They were, for most of human history, and for the people who spent their lives at sea in particular, simply unavailable. The people who sailed wooden ships across oceans, who navigated by stars, who managed thousands of square feet of canvas in Atlantic storms, who fought sea battles and survived, or didn't, were doing all of that while also managing the basic biological realities of existence with what amounted to a platform and a rope. They were not diminished by it. They were simply in a world that had not yet invented the alternative. That world is not so far away. The flush toilet became widespread in cities only in the second half of the 19th century, of all centuries. The people on those ships were not distant primitives. They were the grandparents of people who are still alive. And they managed. Not comfortably, not cleanly, but they managed. The ocean, at least, is large. There's one more thing worth understanding about all of this too, which is what the people on those ships actually thought about their situation. The answer, as far as the historical record tells us, is that they did not think about it the way we would. The reference point did not exist at all. You cannot feel deprived of something you have never encountered, and nobody around you has ever encountered either. The common sailor of 1690 had never used a flush toilet, had never seen one, had never heard of one being used anywhere at all. The idea that waste removal could be private, clean, and immediate was not part of the available imagination at all. The beakhead was not a degradation from some better standard. It was the standard. The complaints were about cold and spray and the danger of falling, not the arrangement, because the arrangement was simply the world as it was. This is what distance and time does to us. We look back and see deprivation where the people living it saw only a Tuesday. That is not a trivial point. It means the entire frame through which we view their lives, the frame of inadequacy and primitive conditions, is one they would not have recognized or understood.